two things that I have always wanted to ask you for a few years, actually. One has to do with this idea of human history as a subdiscipline of the investigation of the past in general. Evolutionary theory is a part of biological history, and Big Bang and subsequent cosmology is also part of the history of the universe. And if you do that, then there is just any investigation of the past. So I'm a theoretical linguist. Part of my discipline is linguistic history. That's also part of history.
Yes.
History of science. These are all parts of human history. And if you view history without any barriers as just any investigation of the past, then it also turns out that forensics is also a study of history. It may be recent, like what happened last week or something like that. And even something like what I think of what happened yesterday is really something that happened yesterday, it no longer exists. That's also history. So anything from now to what happened 2 hours ago is history all the way up to the Big Bang. So first question is, how do you react to this idea? And if we want to do this, how do we get sufficient integration across disciplinary barriers? Integration essentially between people who are doing this. Because our mindsets are fragmented. What do you think is the
Well, I think the idea is certainly absolutely tenable in the sense that it's also partly, it was what began with the Enlightenment, when they started giving a certain seriousness to history, because they argued that everything has a history. I mean, they didn't see it as a totality, but every aspect of life, every aspect that you study in different disciplines, each of these has a history. And what you're really suggesting is that there be an integration of all these separate little histories into one totality of seeing it as a whole. I think that's quite feasible, and in a sense we are coming towards it a little bit. My excitement in life was when I gradually turned from doing history as a discipline in Indology, where you learn the sources and how to read them and all the rest of it, and your interest is in getting information. And then you turn to the social sciences, where your interest is in asking questions of the sources. And the questions are questions that you ask not just from the discipline of history, but from any discipline, any point of view. I mean, my interest, for example, was very much in social and cultural anthropology, because I began to realize that if one applies this notion that societies also change and develop over time due to a variety of factors, and there is such a thing as social evolution, which is of course very unfashionable these days, but I still believe that there is such a thing as social evolution. I think that you cannot get away from the fact that when you're dealing with sources on early societies 2,000 years ago, and you're dealing with small societies, village cultures, small town cultures, which is in fact what our great golden moments were. I mean, the Buddha did come out of a small town society. We forget that. He didn't come out of a metropolis. When you're dealing with that, very often the kinds of analysis, investigation, and questions that scholars today ask of their societies that are small-time societies are the kinds of questions that we could ask our sources. You know, simple things like the difference between the identity of the clan and the identity of the caste. You know, the identity of the clan is an earlier identity, and it has certain givens, which when the identity changes to caste for a variety of reasons, some of those givens, some of those characteristics fall away, others continue. I mean, if you have an identity in a clan which is an identity by birth, that continues in caste. If you have marriage rules, who you can marry and who you can't, that continues in caste. But the whole structure of caste in terms of hierarchy, purity, pollution, etc., is new and different. So I would certainly say that, you know, if you're looking at some element of the past, you have to look at everything around you. Absolutely. Now, your second problem, we faced this problem a little bit in the beginning. You know, when we started JNU, it was very exciting because the Vice Chancellor said to us, devise your own courses. And I don't want any course that is similar to another one in another university. You've got to have new courses, they've got to be interdisciplinary. And we had one which we thought was absolutely crucial to history, which was historical method. And so we spent many man-hours, all 14 or 15 of us, sitting down and battling with what should go into a course that deals with the methodology of writing history. And when we worked this thing out, we also realized that the first year, we had to all sit in on that course, irrespective of who was teaching it. Because that was the only way in which we could, A, get a hang of the course, and B, realize where its weaknesses were.
Yeah.
So all, whatever it was, 16 of us, every
16.
Wednesday afternoon, used to sit there with the students. One person would lead the discussion. The others would sit there and listen. And then there would be a discussion with the students. Then the others would chime in as well. But you have to do that. You know, in any interdisciplinary work, you have to do that.
This is interesting. Three things that you mentioned I want to pick up those. One was reference to change, and the other is evolution, as distinct from history. And the third is the method of history. These are three things that I am also extremely interested in. In the biological history, from the unicellular organisms to chimpanzees and elephants and humans, you can see a kind of directionality. And you can say that is evolution. But I don't know enough history, so I'm wondering. I see change, and I also see continuous change in various directions. But to call it evolution, you have to have some degree of direction in a certain way. And I don't mean progress. So it's not clear that humans are any superior to bacteria.
Right.
But if you look at the biological history, you see from monocellular organisms without nucleus, you have things with nucleus, and then multicellular organisms, then you have vertebrates and so on, and you have you don't have a kind of return back to chimpanzees don't evolve into bacteria.
Right.
Without assigning any superiority. Do you have instance of that in language, which I know something about? There is no evolution. Like there is historical change that happens, there is linguistic history, but they go in various directions going back and whichever it is. So sometimes inflections develop, sometimes inflections disappear, and so on. In both directions, change can happen. In the other aspects of human history, is there actually evolution, or simply, you take different paths?
Well, I think really, in a sense, the problem of evolution has to be seen from 2 points of view. I mean, most of us have always assumed that evolution is that you have a trajectory and everything moves along that trajectory. Now, I don't think that's evolution at all. I think that the importance of evolution is that you have to constantly be looking out at what is moving in a certain direction and what is moving in another direction. Now, this is really the problematic. I mean, some of us would like to see things moving in a nice, straightforward direction. And we get sat upon by other people who say, but of course societies don't move like that, they go all over the place. And it's perfectly true. Societies do go all over the place. But I think, for example, in history, what one should be looking at is not so much the totality of the society moving in a particular way, but institutional changes. that it's a smaller thing, it's a smaller group. For example, things like family. You know, how does a family get constituted? What are the rules and regulations of family? How do those rules and regulations change? And for instance, are we undergoing a situation in some parts of the world today where the institution of the family is breaking up? Will it just disappear? And people will just go back to being citizens of a country or whatever it may be. One has to consider all of that. But I think that if one looks at changes in the smaller groups and the institutions, then it is easier to see some kind of trajectory.
Okay. So, from what you said, in history of family as an institution having an evolutionary direction, I was just thinking, if you look at the history of science from Galileo to now, that I see as evolution in the sense like there is a, I don't want to use the word progress, but knowledge kind of keeps accumulating. And even if you take ideas from the past, it is still, there is a certain directionality that you see, at least in terms of the kinds of things that we can explain today. A high school student today knows more physics than Newton did.
Yeah.
At least that much. And you can see in particular institutions, you see certain kinds of directionality. But if you take the whole of human history, you have, for example, some growth of rationality in the Greek times, and suddenly you just have Middle Ages, and you seem to go backwards quite often. But at least for a short while, you do see what you are talking about.
Yeah, and also the thing is, of course, with evolution, there are lateral moves which are seemingly going backwards, or there may even be moves that are actually going backwards. I think one has to accept that. And that's what I meant in the beginning when I said that, you know, we all grew up with the idea that evolution was simply a straight trajectory.
No, it's not entirely straight.
It's not.
There are cases like, for example, snakes losing their legs and so on. But those are, by and large, those are sort of relatively rare cases, you know. So vertebrates don't become non-vertebrates. You know,
there isn't an absolute going back, but there are lateral movements.
Absolutely,
You know,
so
which changes things. And it's a question really then of probably not saying that this is the trajectory, but leaving it open and allowing, and this is where the survival of the fittest comes in too, that those who are dominant are the ones that determine the trajectory. And I think that is very true of institutions in history. The institutions that are dominant determine the direction of the evolution of history.
Actually, that brings me to the next. Again, I'm going back to education. This is not the view of history that school students or college students have. It's like my learning of history is really remembering, you know, kings and queens and dates and so on, boring stuff. And I, didn't think of history as anything interesting. But if you think of history as study of change, study of evolution, study of understanding how, institutions develop, not just institutions, various kinds of human activities and biological systems develop, then it becomes extremely interesting. Now, how do we bring this into the classroom and help our students develop this historical sense, some understanding of history as opposed to the facts and details and so on?
That's the problem.
You have been involved in education.
I know, I have been involved in it. I mean, one of the sad things was that when many years ago, when I agreed to write these NCRT textbooks for class 6 and class 7, never having written anything for children before, I started off very enthusiastically saying, well now, one would express these things differently. And immediately the examination system came along and said, no, you can't do it like this. You have to keep it to a familiar framework, because remember that the teachers who are teaching it only know that familiar framework. And even though I agreed to keep it to a fairly familiar framework. I mean, you know, the only concession that we made, our lot, in the 1960s and 70s was that instead of kings and queens, or in addition to kings and queens, we brought in a little bit about ordinary people and what was then called social and economic history and that kind of thing. But even then, I remember when I used to travel in slightly out of the way places, I would meet school teachers and I would ask them about, you know, how's it all going, what are you teaching? And those that were teaching history from our books would always say, the books are interesting, but they're very difficult to teach. And I would say, but you know, why are they difficult to teach? You see, it's all new stuff, you know, we are not used to teaching this. There's that attitude in education that you only teach what you yourself have been taught. Mm. Even though that may have been 50 years ago, you still go on teaching the same thing. You know, the whole emphasis on education is that knowledge is something out there. You have to reach it, get it, obtain it. Don't question it. Don't try and change it. Whereas in fact it's the reverse. I mean, what I am talking about today in terms of evolution and history and institutions and so on, I myself hadn't thought of it that way in 1960 when I first started looking at textbooks and so on. So, you know, one develops and changes one's own ideas as one goes along. And that should be reflected. And what angers me most is that today we have the mechanisms. You know, we have television, we have radio, we have internet, we have all these videos, we have this, that and the other, where all of this could be reflected. Yeah. Mm. But it's a complete determination not to use them.
Yeah, yeah. You have only textbooks and teachers, nothing else is allowed. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the doubting and questioning historical method and so on. That also connects to the sort of big history project. So many of the strategies that we use in reconstructing the past are actually common. Mm-hmm. So some of the strategies that we use in historical linguistics of comparative reconstruction, internal reconstruction, are also used in evolutionary biology. Yeah. And central to all forms of historical reconstruction is a theory of change as opposed to theory of history as the basis for investigating the past. So you need quantum mechanics and relativity to understand the Big Bang. You need a theory of selection, which is not a theory of history. Or assume for the moment that Darwin's selection and fitness are more or less on the right track. We might need to tweak a little bit. But these are not theories of the past, these are theories of the present. You use that to investigate the past. So Darwin called it, I think, homogeneity principle. If you cannot violate the homogeneity principle. Many students actually don't know that this is what we do. We begin with our knowledge of the present to look at the past. And the knowledge of the present has to be clearly articulated and say, this is what we cannot violate when we look at the past. And historians actually, when they look at the past, have some implicit mental model of that theory of change. But students don't quite realize that this is what is happening. So if we want our students to understand that this is how we investigate the past, it doesn't matter which field, that we have a theory of change, without articulating the counterpart of, for example, theory of selection in Darwinian theory, or relativity and quantum mechanics in physical history. In human history, we need that basis to look at the past. So how do we, I don't know what question to ask. Have you tried using that in your teaching, or if we wanted to do it, somehow bring it into school curriculum?
Well,
how do we do it?
I've tried doing that in my teaching, but then I've been teaching postgraduate students, you see, and so you start them off by saying, well, this event has happened. And the kind of teaching that was alternate to the normal kind of teaching was what I started doing at JNU. So they allowed that there, and it was very nice. And this was the 1970s, when there were lots of things happening, which various political groups were saying, oh, but this is the past, we're defending the past, we're protecting the past, or, you know, we're putting right the errors of the past. And that the Rath Yatra, for example, to Ayodhya was supposed to be avenging the raid of Mahmud of Ghazni. So with that, it is possible to say, now look, here's a problem, which is a problem of the present, but it's being projected as a problem of the past. So we have to look at what the linkage is. How did the past see this problem? How did others along the line see it, and how are we seeing it? Now there, of course, what happened was that I was terribly interested in what I think is the fundamental now of teaching history, which is historiography. How does a historian, at a particular point in time, interpret the past? And, you know, one can pick up a historian like Kalhana, the Rajatarangani in the 12th century AD. How is he interpreting the past? And how are we interpreting that past differently from the way he's interpreting? And that, in a sense, I think, if one can do, then students begin to understand that interpretation in itself is something of the present and has to do with what is the degree of knowledge we have now. Is it greater than what he had in the 12th century? And therefore, can we make generalizations which are different from his? And the whole understanding of the nature of history that will change.
I don't know enough about historiography, but there are two conflicting views in my head. One is historiography as the study of how historians in various cultures interpret. And you find that they interpret things differently depending upon their personalities
and the culture.
The other is sort of normative, but it's not descriptive, in the sense, what are the norms of inquiry? So if it is science, you can study how scientists actually did it, let's say in Greek times or Galileo's time, the kinds of difficulties that Kepler had in accepting that the Earth goes in an elliptical orbit. No, circle is a perfect one. How can you deviate from that? But this is the kind of study of the norms that people had in the past or various cultures. The norms that we have now, they may not be followed. So norms like absence of logical contradiction, explaining data, etc., etc. These are norms that we expect the community to share. So from that perspective, what will be the sort of normative epistemological principles that we want our students to follow, which is not a descriptive one. So if we had that, then we could then unify study of human history with
other studies.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is the reason why I think that it's terribly important to give much more emphasis to historical method and to historiography. I mean, historical method is really looking at, and the two are integrated, they're not separate things. It's really looking at how particular historians are changing the way in which we analyze a situation and analyze sources. And there have been very substantial changes, especially in the last 50 years, where you've gone from, but you've had varieties of interpretations like Marxism, postmodernism, post-colonialism, and so on, where the attempt is to suggest that depending on how you analyze the sources, you come to a sort of different conclusion. And I think that this, without sort of going the whole hog, I mean, I really can't take what postmodernism does, which is that everybody has a right to their interpretation and every interpretation is of the same quality and has to have the same priority. I think that is nonsense. There has to be a basis on which you make your interpretation, and the judgment of the interpretation is as much in what you are finally saying as the steps by which you got there. Now, this is beginning to happen in historiography in the sense that it's much easier to work on modern historians, contemporary historians, and analyze, what were the influences in their lives, because you ask questions like, what were the books they were reading when they were writing on this particular subject, and who were they talking to, and so on, all this comes in. But apart from that, it's the notion that the person is not acting in a vacuum. There is a culture and a society in which he is living, he or she, and that there is an intellectual influence on the historian, which has to be gauged. Now, once you start doing that, then you're really probing into the way in which the person has been thinking. I mean, some people might object and say this is probing into a person's private life because one's thinking is very private. But on the other hand, to the extent that it's expressed in a public form, in the form of a book or an article or a paper or something, it is necessary to ask the question as to, you know, who is this person, what's the background, why is he or she thinking in this way, why are they arriving at these conclusions, which makes the pursuit of history very much more interesting as well.
Okay, what about the other part, the historical method? So if two historians write histories, it'll be interesting to find out why one person wrote X and the other person wrote Y, or in fact, not even Y, but not X.
Yes.
But we are now not making any choice between these two. We are simply trying to understand why they did it.
Why.
But we also need to, if there's a conflict between two historians, we need a way of resolving the conflict. That is, if they're logically contradictory, they cannot both be knowledge. That is where the historical, I'm assuming historical method would come in, right? Saying how do you, because it couldn't be the case all interpretations
well,
are.
you know, the whole issue of what sources are you using, what are your notions of causation, historical causation, and how logical is your analysis. These would be extremely important issues. Which is really what is now coming into discussions of when a historian writes a new book. If it's a worthwhile book, then others in that field will analyze it in these terms.
Okay.
That's becoming a demarcation between the kinds of reviews that you get in the media and the kinds of reviews you get in a scholarly journal.
What can I know about what you mentioned as theories of historical causation? But because that seems to me to be very similar to theory of selection and so on. We have to have notions of causation as a theory of the present, actually, how changes happen.
I know that there are some studies that have been made of it. I'm really not all that familiar with theory. I've just dabbled in it. But it's really partly the way in which you use it. How does a historian use the notion of causation? Which means, how is a historian reading a source? And what are the questions that the historian is asking? So it varies very much from person to person, from subject to subject.
Is there a sort of general notion of causation or historical causation or theory of causation that shared across the community? That I'm again thinking of what we can teach our school students.
Yeah.
You know, because if they have some understanding of
that,
historical causation, then they will be able to critically evaluate historical interpretations. So how do we do that?
I think at the moment, as far as I know, I may be completely wrong on this, causation is still a fairly broad-based general thing. We haven't really got down to too much detail. Mind you, some of the new writing that is coming up, that has been coming up in the last 2 decades or so, has been giving quite a lot of emphasis to this issue of causation. But I don't know of any single book or set of books that actually discuss this idea as a way of approaching history.
So there might be, I'm thinking, causation is something that all of us are concerned with. Biologists are interested in causation. Medical research has causation. physics has causation. Every subject has causation built into it. So if people in different fields came together, historians, philosophers, physicists,
and wrote a book on causation.
No, they came together, at least did some brainstorming.
Hmm.
Writing a book is perhaps, like 20 years from now. But minimally, we kind of get a general picture of causation across fields. And for students, I think, if not an authoritative book, at least seeing people brainstorming.
Would be, yes,
Yeah.
worthwhile.
Yeah, and at least some reports of that kind of brainstorming. So if you wanted to have a brainstorming session of that kind.
And it's the kind of thing that isn't done.
Yeah.
And needs to be done much more. I mean, if we did have things like people sitting together and brainstorming on causation, on objectivity, on
Yeah.
generalization. I mean, this is what we used to call COG.
Cog.
As Bhagesh will remember, we used to call it COG in our historical method. The COG in the machine.
Oh, I see, okay.
Causation, objectivity, and generalization.
Fantastic. COG is a fantastic thing to do.
And
In fact,
the whole of history works on these,
Yeah.
on this COG. Now,
Yeah.
the thing is that we take up examples of historical analyses, but we don't take up these issues in the abstract and say, let's discuss them across disciplines.
Yeah.
And causation would be an ideal issue.
In fact, now that you mention it, I think COG would be fantastic. COG in human history, in biology, in chemistry, in linguistics, in in philosophy, all of them together would be fantastic. We need to get different people coming together to talk to one another.
Yeah.
And that is something that students will benefit. I'm interested in integration across disciplines.
Right.
So the idea of extending COG to all disciplines
Yeah.
is very attractive.
No, it's, this is the tragedy of our education system, that people don't understand how there's a linkage all the way across.
Yeah.
That, knowledge is not something that is only confined to one subject. It has an impact on absolutely everything. And that's very hard to explain.
Yeah, and my wife and I have been writing a book on rational inquiry in general, and generalization is one of the chapters in this, and there are many others, such as reasoning and variability and so on and so on. But we have identified about 12 topics, and this reminds me that we completely forgot causation and objectivity. We should
very fundamental.
completely forgot.